What up, y'all? St. Pete. So today I'm going to get into some of my favorite subject, which is psychology, and we're going to break a few things down. First, I want to show you a couple books that I'll be taking stuff from, which is Propaganda, Edward Bernays, Crystallizing Public Opinion, Edward Bernays, and Public Relations, right, Edward Bernays. If you don't know who Bernays is, you really need to do some research, especially if you're the type of person that watches the news. If you watch the news, you should really know what it is that you're watching. Edward Bernays is the godfather of advertising and public relations, and convincing people to buy things that they don't really need. Because prior to advertising, prior to Edward Bernays, America was the type of place where people bought things that they needed. There was more supply than there was demand, because Americans would have shoes till they have a hole in them, or they would have one or two pairs of pants. They had enough that was able to get them through. So it wasn't through the advent of Edward Bernays that this idea of marketing and manipulating people started to play into the picture. So this is out of Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda, and it says, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we never heard of, in almost every act of our daily lives, whether it's in the sphere of politics or business, in our social contact or our ethical thinking. We are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires, which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world." So this relates to what I talk about when I talk about the occult, and I talk about this is a hidden psychology. Essentially what we're dealing with is people that have this hidden understanding to the way the mind works. So it's about manipulating that. And they do it with groupthink. So what we're going to be talking about here is group thinking, being caught in the group. So this contrived proclivity to engage in group identification is, according to Bernays, a function of the enlarged sense of self-importance that individuals derive from identifying with a potential powerful mass. What he's saying is, you are identifying with this group because it makes you feel powerful. I wanted to add too that Bernays is the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund Freud was, into breaking down the individual, whereas his nephew Bernays was about breaking down the masses of people. The systematic study of mass psychology revealed the potentialities of invisible government of society by manipulation of the motives which actuate man in the group. These studies established that the group has mental characteristics distinct from those of the individual and is motivated by impulses and emotions which cannot be explained on the basis of what we know of individual psychology. So the question naturally arose, if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it? That's deep. Now, when I'm saying this stuff, take into consideration what's going on today. All right? Nothing is done in the political sphere without public relations. None of these men, like the president or whatever, they're not just shooting from the hip. This isn't what they come up with. They have public relations that iron stuff out for them. Everything is known in advance before the conversations with the public carry on. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind what we see unraveling in front of us. The insights of group psychology to control the masses is partly a function of the fact an individual can be influenced by a crowd even if one is physically isolated. Crowd does not mean merely a physical aggregation of a number of persons. The crowd is rather a state of mind. If one can design propaganda or psychological operations that bypass the conscious and rational faculties of the individual, targeting instead suppressed emotions and hidden desires, it is possible to move people to adopt beliefs and behaviors without them being aware of the underlying motivations leading them on. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about, these political movements. When we see these activist groups, they say that they're fighting for this cause. But that's just how they trigger people to start moving in the directions that they want. Remember, whenever you see the corporations get behind the unrest, it's a clear indication of, this is contrived. It is possible, but difficult for an individual to become aware of the underlying motives driving their beliefs and actions through honest and critical introspection. Once one succumbs to the effects of group identity, such critical introspection becomes nearly impossible. In identifying with a group, the individual subordinates self-analysis and a discerning search for the truth in favor of maintaining group interest and cohesion. That's why I never personally understood being part of any kind of group, because you are sacrificing, what you think, because there's no way that you're going to agree with all the tenets. So at what point, when you're involved in one of these groups, do you start agreeing with things that you disagree with? In the modern day, there appears to be forces operating through the mainstream media and popular culture which are attempting to increase the individual's proclivity to engage in certain types of group identification. Now, mind you, this is the kind of stuff that they figured out in the early 1900s, around World War I. They figured this kind of stuff out. This is all coming from the psychoanalysis. This isn't my opinion, you know. It should be clear that when I'm stating my opinion compared to when I'm reading, that these aren't my words. These are their words that were figured out in the early 1900s. So we can only imagine the techniques that they have today, which we can explore later. But for now, this is a good foundation for understanding how the mainstream media interacts with the public. Identifications that divide the population in groups has dire consequences for the stability and freedom of a society. It allows for the age-old divide and conquer. And that's what's happening, folks. We're being divided and we're being conquered. By dividing a population along the lines of race, class, religion, gender, or political preference, or in other words, into groups naturally prone to clash, the effects of group psychology render rational discourse and debate between individuals in these separate groups highly unlikely. And that's what we see. We don't even see debate amongst Antifa types and the left and the right. We'll just say left and the right. We don't even see debates. We don't see nothing scholarly going on. This is just madness. Each group considers its own standards ultimate and indisputable, and tends to dismiss all contrary or different standards as indefensible. Do we not see that? A society dominated by such groups is thus easily divided in increasingly hostile conflict, like we see now, which weakens the population as a whole. While we are fighting, our eyes are off those behind the scenes who Bernays calls the invisible government, which control the destinies of millions. Now, I want to read, this one is a perfect example of this in action. In the early 50s, a perverted form of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic approaches, championed by Freud's nephew Edward Bernays, was sweeping America, even to the point where the CIA was using it for mass control of the population. A place where it proved very successful was in the unassuming kitchens of middle-class families. Betty Crocker Foods had produced an instant cake mix. All you need to do is add water to the supplied powder. By today's standards, the result was probably quite unpalatable, but in that time, it was something of a miracle. The problem was that the miracle cake mix did not sell. Undaunted, Betty Crocker Foods turned to the new science of psychoanalysis to help solve the problem. In other words, to make people buy something that the company already knew they did not want. Crocker hired a Madison Avenue ad campaign firm to investigate through psychoanalysis the underlying reasons housewives did not want the cake mix. The conclusion of the study was that although the average American housewife was very much appreciated the convenience of the cake mix, she felt guilty about deceiving her husband and family into thinking she had worked hard for them, when in fact she had done very little work and put very little of herself and her own love into the project. And we all know when you cook with love, that food tastes much better, you know. The energy that you put into the food, the reason why you're cooking it is, you know, for all my cooks out there, you already know. The answer offered to Betty Crocker by the psychologist they hired was quite simple. All that needed to be done was to add 3 words onto the instructions of the box of cake mix. Add 1 egg. An egg, as one of the most important and ancient archetypes, holds deep connotations of life, birth, and creation, making the entire process of making the cake more meaningful in the housewife's mind. In this way, she would, in proxy, be giving birth to her husband and family. Changing the recipe to add an egg to the mixture offered the guilty housewife a way out. By doing more than adding water, by adding an ingredient which was psychologically intertwined with her own life-giving and creative capabilities, she could assuage her guilt. The end result? Sales of Betty Crocker's unwanted cake mix soared. There's a great documentary called The Century of Self. You can look on YouTube and find it, Century of Self. It's a BBC documentary, and it lays it out very, very well. It's actually surprising. All of the things that we've come to accept as being normal, the way almost everything that we call social norms have been contrived, even to the idea of smoking cigarettes for women in public, because there was a time when that was, you know, unfavorable for women to be smoking cigarettes in public. So what Bernays did is he staged an event, had some women light up cigarettes in public, and had the media right there to capture it. Took them images, added words like liberty on the front page of the newspaper, added the words like liberty to the women smoking the cigarette with their little torch of freedom. The cigarette's the torch of freedom. Remember I was telling you about that torch. When you see that torch and that flame, they were able to change the whole social paradigm. And this has been there's just countless. I'm just giving you guys just a few, you know what I mean? Because we could go on for hours about how they've done this and everything. I mean, Rockefeller even said that, you know, the reason that they funded the women's movement was to get the women out of the house so they could have more people to tax, and so that they can raise your children. So they made it, oppressive for a woman to be a housewife. They made that seem like undesirable, you know, and they put it with the pretense of women's liberation. So that's why we have to be very, very careful of the motives of those who seem to have our best interest at hand. I'm going to read a little something out of propaganda. All right. There are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. It is not generally realized to what extent the words and actions of our most influential public men are dictated by shrewd persons operating behind the scenes. Now, what is still more important, the extent to which our thoughts and habits are modified by authorities. In some departments of our daily life in which we imagine ourselves free agents, we are ruled by dictators exercising great power. A man buying a suit of clothes imagines that he is choosing, according to his taste and his personality, the kind of garment which he prefers. In reality, he may be obeying the orders of an anonymous gentleman tailor in London. This is the silent partner in a modest tailoring establishment which is patronized by gentlemen of fashion and princes of blood. He suggests to British noblemen and others a blue cloth instead of gray, 2 buttons instead of 3, or sleeves a quarter of an inch narrower than last season. The distinguished customers approve of the idea. But how does this fact affect John Smith of Topeka? The gentleman tailor is under contract with a certain large American firm which manufactures men's suits to send them instantly the designs of the suits chosen by the leaders of the London fashion. Upon receiving the designs with specifications as to color, weight, and texture, the firm immediately places an order with the cloth makers for several $100,000 worth of cloth. The suits made up according to the specifications are then advertised as the latest fashion. The fashionable men in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia wear them, and the Topeka man recognizes this leadership does the same thing. Wow. I mean, we see where, the style is gone. That's, the way people are dressing now. I mean, compared to when I was growing up, So, if you can influence the leaders, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. But men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be subject to the influences of mass psychology. Because man is by nature social, he feels himself to be a member of a herd. Even when he is alone in his room with curtains drawn, his mind retains the patterns which have been stamped on by the group influences. Trotter and Le Bon concluded that the group mind does not think in a strict sense of the word. In place of thoughts, it has impulses, habits, and emotions. In making up its mind, its first impulse is usually to follow the example of a trusted leader. This is one of the most firmly established principles of mass psychology. It operates in establishing the rising or diminishing prestige of a summer resort, in causing a run on a bank or a panic on the stock exchange, in creating a bestseller or a box office success. Men are rarely aware of the reasons which motivate their actions. A man may believe he buys a motor car because, after careful study of the technical features of all makes on the market, he has concluded that this is the best. He is almost certainly fooling himself. He bought it perhaps because a friend whose financial acumen he respects bought one last week, or because his neighbors believed he was not able to afford a card of that class. Or because his colors are those of his college fraternity. It is chiefly the psychologists of the school of Freud who have pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires which has been obliged to suppress. A thing may be desired not for its intrinsic worth or usefulness, but because he has unconsciously come to see in it a symbol of something else, the desire for which he is ashamed to admit to himself. A man buying a car may think he wants it for purposes of locomotion, whereas the fact may be that he would really prefer not to be burdened with it and would rather walk for the sake of his health. He may really want it because it is a symbol of social position, an evidence of his success in business, or a means of pleasing his wife. This general principle that men are very largely actuated by motives which they conceal from themselves is as true of mass as of individual psychology. That they did. It is evident that the successful propagandist must understand the true motives and not be content to accept the reasons which men give for what they do. So I'll end it on, there was, when the Cadillac, back in the beginning days of marketing, the Cadillac came out with a new edition, with a new car, new style that was longer than the one previous to that. So in the commercial at that time, now remember, this is back in the 1900s, so it's primitive, you know. But the woman, they had a woman driving the new car, and she's driving it. She's like, "Oh, it's so big." See, they capitalized on this repressed sexual urges that Freud says is beneath the surface of all of us, that we have these repressed sexual desires. Whether I agree or not, I'm just saying what he said, you know, that they are able to manipulate. Like I said with the egg, you know, they know these archetypes, these Jungian archetypes, which we could get into at some other time. But just some ideas. You know, turn the TV off. Stop getting your information from the TV. Stop it. It's not helping you. It's not giving you any kind of truth. So turn the TV off. Fuck the mainstream media. And be dangerous to those who threaten our freedom. St. Pete, I'm out. Peace.